I'm going to tell you what Lahabrea is doing in Pandaemonium and how the story will unfold. I've spent days examining every piece of info I could, and I found a ton of extremely cool stuff. If you think that raid stories are pretty cool but a little bit undercooked, I'm about to blow your mind. First, let's talk about the place itself, Pandaemonium. As with everything in Endwalker, there's an awful lot in a name. Like almost everything else in ancient society, Pandaemonium comes from Greek. It roughly translates to all demons or all demon place. As things go, it's actually fairly common in Final Fantasy overall. It's a place in 3 other games so far. The first 2 are places which don't seem very relevant though, so we'll kind of skip through them, but Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy IX both have Pandaemonium. The third though has tons of connections. It's Final Fantasy II's Pandaemonium, which is the Palace of Hell raised from Hell itself to the capital of the Empire by the dead Emperor Matthias. But I'd love to go into it, but it feels a little bit like a red herring. Our new Pandaemonium is actually a lot closer to the real origin of the name, and I'm not kidding you, the 17th century epic poem Paradise Lost. In Paradise Lost, Lucifer is banished to Hell, also called Tartarus, after a failed rebellion against God. Tartarus, which, is a Greek word itself, is a prison for the dead. Although in the earliest of myths, it was used only to trap away threats that, would threaten the gods of Olympus, which, is just like our Pandaemonium is. Allegedly. Now, in the poem, Pandaemonium is the capital city of Hell, from which Lucifer, or Satan, uses his rhetorical skill, just charisma stat, to gather a following of fallen angels, with the ultimate goal being to corrupt Earth and mankind, just as revenge against God. Obviously, he succeeds. Eve eats the fruit, so man, Adam and Eve, are booted from Eden and are left on their own, independent of God, which is actually kind of like what Vina did when she clipped our wings. So far, we don't know much about what's going on in our Pandaemonium, except that Erichthonius and Hesperos fell to some corrupting influence, some whispers, some sort of terrifying creature. But there's also the dread beast Pandaemonium that's steeped in darkness buried deep within, according to Themis. At the beginning, it seems fairly run-of-the-mill overall. Eric's gone mad and transformed, but we snap him out of it and kill 2 seemingly unrelated bosses. That's business as usual, until we encounter Hesperos, and then we find that he's not actually gone mad, but that he actually completely believes his new mission wholeheartedly, like he's seen the light. By the way, Lucifer means Lightbringer in Latin. So first off, we have the very obvious allegory to Paradise Lost Lucifer. Just whispering things, telling people, convincing them. But hang on a second, that's Christian stuff, and Lucifer is a Latin name, but Endwalker's heavily focused on the Greek side of things, so we need to explore that first. Like I said earlier, every name in Endwalker tells a story in its own right. Erichthonius, our jailer friend with daddy issues, is right to feel strange about his father, Lahabrea, because Greek myth gets really, really weird. So in Greek myth, Erichthonius was the son of Athena and Hephaestus, but like with most Greek stories, this wasn't exactly a normal parenthood. Athena, the goddess of a few different things, including warfare, went to see Hephaestus about some weapons, for war, but he took too much of a liking to her. In what I'm going to call his one-sided attempts to court her, she resists and leaves, but she ends up with a little bit of his dynamis, his unrealized potential, on her thigh. In disgust, she wipes it off with some wool and throws it to the ground. And that's how Erichthonius is born, of the earth. And that's why his name comes from the words for wool and earth, although wool or strife can be interchangeable. Anyway, as grim as that is, the myth tells us 2 things. One is his symbology. He's connected to snakes. Like Lucifer, in Paradise Lost, he uses a snake to convince Eve to eat the fruit, and then he's later turned into one as punishment. The second, then, is soft confirmation that Lahabrea's real name is actually Hephaestus. I say confirmation because the short story Through His Eyes basically told us that. He has this really strong affinity for both fire and creation, which are both very obvious clues when you look at, Hades, Greek names, stuff like that. The other boss name of real note then is Hesperos. No dodgy conception stories here, though. He's just the regular son of the dawn goddess Eos, standard stuff, sort of. The interesting part, though, is that his name means evening star, which is a reference to the planet Venus when it's seen at night. And then he has a brother called Phosphorus. Phosphorus, light matches the element, and that means morning star. That's Venus when it rises before the sun, and as the next brightest star after the sun, it seems to herald in the dawn. And that earned it the name Lightbringer, or Lucifer. This kind of sparked a debate in the philosophy of language, but at face value, Hesperos means Venus, which can also mean Lucifer. Trust me, that's sort of relevant. Here's another Greek term for you, by the way. Apotheosis. It literally means to deify, and it applies in two separate ways to the events we've seen so far. Hesperos calls himself a hemitheos, meaning half-god. He seeks to deify himself through merging with his own creations. Sadly for him, though, being called a hemitheos is actually usually reserved for normal men who portrayed heroic and godly behaviour in their life. Then, they're granted that term after death. And as for merging with a Virgulacus, or a vampire, the Greeks believed that's the fate of someone who lived a sacrilegious life. So, in attempting to deify himself through apotheosis, Hesperos actually is less godly than when he begun, thematically speaking. The other way that apotheosis applies is that it means to worship a mortal as a god, which is precisely the way Hesperos talks about Lahabrea. The other two bosses we've seen so far are named with intent. Hippocampus, the second boss, is a sea serpent, and the namesake of that is actually the area of the brain that deals with memory. Now, that's generally a small point, but with a lot of Shadowbringers with Endwalker, we're constantly dealing with memory crystals and ultimately the idea of memory and legacy. So I thought that was a kind of cute thing. But the real important one is Phoinix. Phoinix. It seems a bit self-explanatory, but I genuinely do have to talk about Lahabrea before I can get to that. So, how is Lahabrea connected? Like with Hades, Emet-Selch, the connection to his name is a little more conceptual than it is literal, so today we'll only focus on the shared parts that they've told us about. There's his aspects of fire and creation, obviously, but then there's the love for his soulmate, Athena. Obviously, in some myths, like our earlier one, his love is unfortunately one-sided, but generally, though, the Greeks are reasonable. They considered the two of them married and, basically two sides of the same coin, soulmates in a way. And that's backed up for us by the way that Athena actually had the seat of Lahabrea before Hephaestus did. So, they are actually deeply connected. Although he does seem like a real bastard, treating his son coldly ever since the wife died and, never seeming to mourn her loss at face value is really quite grim. But I think, kind of like how Fortunato threw himself into his work to protect the twins, I think Lahabrea's lost himself in his creations after Athena died. The kind of throw yourself into work as a way to cope. But then, what's he been doing for his work? There's a pretty big hint in the short story that I mentioned earlier. It's called Through His Eyes. It's up on the Square Enix website. It has Hades, who's recently been appointed Emet-Selch, helping Hythlodaeus with a little problem. And that problem is Lahabrea's Phoenix. It was this beautiful creation with incredible healing powers. It was, like a phoenix, effectively immortal. But the strange thing was, it had a soul. They thought that was impossible, but Hythlodaeus said that a drifting soul filled with regret was accidentally caught within it during conception, so it was just in this building, crashing into things, hurting itself, exploding itself in this frenzy, but then it could just heal itself and continue. It was a tragic, awful thing, so Hades ultimately had to deal with it by putting it down. The Phoenix we fight in Asphodelos is called a violent, failed iteration of the iconic immortal bird. So it seems like Lahabrea is trying to create a proper version of Phoenix, and one that can act as a vessel for souls. That's not going to go very well. Before I go further though, I have to share a little failed idea from this script. With all of the snake and Lucifer hints and allegories, I was so sure that Lahabrea was going to turn out to basically be Satan. His Esper equivalent is called Matthias. And Emperor Matthias from FF2's Pandaemonium was obviously, Pandaemonium, hell, those connections are there. But also, he was called Satan in the novelization. The whole theme of Lucifer coming from Venus being seen as the star that challenged the brightness of the sun in the morning, but ultimately failed. The whole fallen angel allegory, that was so strong that I was so convinced I was onto something. But I had forgotten. There was one very important thing that I hadn't actually accounted for, and that was all of the ties to death that we see in Pandaemonium. The first major relevance to death, and actually kind of like a bridge to the Lucifer allegory, which is, just a little wink, Asphodelos, our first wing. An asphodel is a flower associated with death, and it's one that supposedly grows in the underworld. It's also used as a remedy for snake bites. So, isn't it funny that in Asphodelos, we sort of saved Erichthonius from Hesperos' influence, and Hesperos is another name for Lucifer? Anyway, the next area we're going to is Abyssos. That's historically connected to the story of Abzu, which is the dark chaotic sea before creation. Abyssos itself means the bottomless pit of hell. Whatever we find down there is definitely going to be atrocious, but it's where we go after that interests me. After mourning, after death, after burial, after the endless abyss. Realistically, the only way is up. And by that, I mean resurrection, or as the Greek would call it, anastasis. It begins with A, and it's Greek, so I assume this is what they're going to call it. But anyway, anastasis is the theme that I think connects everything else so far. So Lahabrea lost his wife, he ignored his son, he pursued his work wholeheartedly, which included experimenting on immortal creatures in a place with heavy relation to death, even though it picked up a soul full of regret one time. And that's all you're going to find in Tartarus, in hell, in Pandaemonium. You're going to find dead people that are being punished, dead that are full of regret. They're not going to be happy. And he's working away in all of this? That certainly seems very, very suspicious. But there is one last thing that I think ties it all together. Here's where it all kind of starts to add up, and we have Sokin's music to thank for it. Hic sunt leones, or here comes lions, is a term used to mark unexplored areas on maps, or was anyway. This place might be dangerous, so stay away. Here comes lions, here comes dragons, that stuff. Now, the song itself feels like it's about exploring the darker side of man, the bestial side, seemingly in death. The wild freaks, dangerous creatures, perverted and evil. See what's inside you, the sickness that drives you. Painted black, demoniac. Die, grieve, mind are deceased, rotting and aching, their true soul awaking. Perfect, born free, all torn, till there's nothing left but ash. This paints a really grotesque picture. The dead rising, coming to feast on us. That last line about ash is actually a direct reference to something that Emmett Selk says about Lahabrea in another short story, the one that's Ere Our Curtain Falls. It's beautiful, by the way, but it's incredible. This all comes together. I think Lahabrea is experimenting on the souls of the dead, trying to revive Athena, and that's what we're doing down there. That's what we're going to slowly uncover and ultimately have to defeat. The dread beast Pandaemonium, as Themis calls it, could be an amalgam of tortured souls fused into one terrible creation, screaming and unraveling their prison from the inside. And that's it, I think. That's why Lahabrea is so engrossed in his work. It explains why he hasn't mourned and spent time with his kid. It explains the Phoinix, all its ties to rebirth, all its ties to immortality. It explains the secrecy of Pandaemonium. It also explains its ties to death, despite that usually being Hades' domain instead of Hephaestus's. And most of all, I think, it makes for a really classical story, and I think one of my favourites overall. I think TV Tropes calls it the necromantic. The trying to resurrect a loved one, no matter what the cost. Anyone who's watched Full Metal Alchemist will know that very well, or Evangelion, or maybe even Nanoha, stuff like that. It's such a classical story. It would also be really satisfying for us because we can see that Eric can realise that his father really did love his mother, and then Lahabrea can be snapped out of his obsession in kind by his son, And they can finally, you know, sit down, bond, and mourn together after all of this. I think it'll be, if they can do it right, I think it'll be beautiful. But wait, there's more. There's one last little bit. And we haven't talked at all about Themis. He's a little bit of a side note, I think, but he's still, you know, he's still an important character who's there with us. So how does he fit? He's Elidibus. He's Elidibus. He has to be. He's just, it's not a very well-kept secret. He's trying to sort of go, I'm Themis. You don't know me, but we all know. Themis is the personification of justice and order in Greek myth, which includes the rightly ordered family, which is, you know, that's basically Elidibus' job in the convocation as the emissary. He's supposed to keep the convocation together. And then we look at what he's doing. He's helping to solve problems without actually reporting them to the convocation, in league with Azim, which is very surprising. He can summon in copies of us, of heroes, like he does in 5.3. Azim is his dear friend. He's wearing white robes, but is clearly young, so he's not going to be, like, retired from his seat. And the only people who can wear white robes are those who've retired and those who are Elidibus. So he's definitely Elidibus. He's just going out of his way not to tell people that. And as for how he fits into the story as part of all this, I have no idea. I just think he's really cool. I think it's amazing how they took Elidibus from this, like, boring bit player with who no one really cared around to this, just this really tragic villain in 5.3. But now, a little bit later, he's this fun ally, and he kind of feels a little bit like a little brother. In fact, he's actually a lot like Alphinaud, now that I think about it. You know, Themis and Azim, Alphinaud and the Warrior of Light. I hope you kind of see what I mean, because that's really interesting, actually. Anyway, that's Pandaemonium, broken down and speculated on. You wouldn't believe how many ideas I had to actually cut from the script just because they wouldn't fit. There's stuff about Igeorm and ice versus Lahabrea's fire in the first fight, the temperature control stuff. There's Hepharos' Hemitheos idea, which kind of connects to Lucifer, Shemhazai, and the Nephilim. Man, researching this was an absolute ride. I really hope you enjoyed following me on this sort of rant. But if you did, if you think I'm onto something, please let me know. If you think I've written bad fanfic, please don't tell me. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I guess we'll see you next time.